I can't tell you how happy Ruham and I are to be here with all of you. And in a special way, thanks to Bishop Stokes and to Susan for their hospitality and for being so welcoming. You don't know what a treat it is for us to be here, because you get the 4 seasons, you get the snow and the winter and the fall. You get the 4 seasons. Where I come from, there's 2 seasons. They're called hot and hotter. And you just go back and forth between those 2 seasons. And it's really exciting to be here with all of you. And I got it. I got the whole schedule. I'm not taking it personal, okay? I know why I'm the speaker after lunch. They decided, get the loud Latino, right? And he'll speak after lunch, and that way they won't fall asleep. And hopefully that will be the case. We're going to talk about something that's very exciting to me. And I hope it'll be exciting for you. And if you're not into it already, well, by now you're a slow learner. Because the first 2 people who spoke today, Tracy and Chris, wow, they're preaching my gospel. They are preaching my gospel. And it is for me a joy to be able to continue preaching that gospel. And I got a little talk up here that I've entitled something. It's going to show up on the screen in just a moment for you. And talking God in the 21st century. I want to give you a little bit of the story behind this. I've worked for 22 years as a priest, mostly dedicating my life to parish work because that's my passion. But somehow God has a way of putting you in other places. So a little bit about my personal story, since we're talking about stories today and how our story is rooted in God's story. When I was 7 or 8 years old, I used to pull weeds in my neighbor's yards. If you grew up in South Florida, you understand that you got lots of humidity, lots of weeds. So I started making some money at a very early age, and then I got myself a cheap lawnmower and got to cut people's yards, and $5–10 did it, but I used to go and buy records with my money. Remember 45s? Who remembers 45s? Oh, great. I'm speaking your language. If you don't know what a 45 is, you're just too young. So they were like this, and they were $1. And I had hundreds of those things. And I decided that I needed to be a DJ. So around the 5th or 6th grade, I used to DJ after school at the after-school parties at my public school. And it was a lot of fun. And then, you know, as time went on, I built quite a business. 14, 15, wow, you know, DJing. And then at the same time, I was very involved in my youth group, my parish youth group. And it was very interesting because that experience of youth ministry and music and all of that, it all kind of came together. And eventually I began to hear this very, very clear call from God, okay, I need you to play my music now. I need you to do something. And that's when I began to feel a call to ministry. And one of the things that we did in my youth group at the age of 15, believe it or not, or 16, is we used to go out into the neighborhood and invite people to come to church. What a concept, right? I remember the first house we knocked on. I remember the lady was like in shock. She looked at us. She was an Italian-American lady. I'll never forget. And she looked at us and said, "You mean you're not Jehovah's Witnesses?" We started doing that, and I really felt that somehow God was telling me something about evangelism and what that would mean later. At that time, it wasn't so clearly identified priesthood, but the call to ministry was there. And I've got to tell you that as time has developed, I have seen the hand of God at every stage of my life leading me. And I'm sure all of you can identify the hand of God is present in all of our lives. When I was a senior in high school and I was sure I was going into the seminary right after high school, I was a host for a program on public radio. It was, you know, community public radio, and I had a youth program that I conducted. So I said, when I go to seminary, media will be over. The whole thing, that's it. DJ, chapter, everything closed. That's the past. It's no longer going to happen again. Well, I wasn't out of seminary and into priestly ministry when about 2 or 3 years later, boom, I get this contract from Telemundo, you know, at that time owned by Sony TriStar, and I didn't know that in my congregation, my second parish in Miami Beach, there were a bunch of producers and people from the TV world, and they would come and hear my sermons and said, oh, we got to put this guy on TV, but they never counted on me. They just did this. And then one day I get this call, you got to come, you got to come, you got to come, that they had interviewed all these Latino priests and that they needed, you know, a talk show host with spirit, so they needed a priest. And so it was a crazy idea right from the get-go. Imagine my priest friends started calling me Father Springer. And some of the Latinos would call me Father Christina. And then when I started doing my work, they started calling me Father Oprah, and that made me very happy. So I prefer Father Oprah to all those other titles. But really, I've got to tell you, the media thing did a number on me, because I began to hear how lots of people were not so interested in our church box, not interested in what they saw out there as religious denominations or places to live and worship and to just be faithful people. So I began to understand that we needed to be out of the box if we were going to reach the greater, larger population. So this afternoon's topic that I'm sharing with you is the result of God's hand at work in my life for a long time. And I just want to open my heart to you and share it with you. And I hope that you will take it from that perspective and hopefully apply some of it to your own ministry and to whatever God is asking you to do right now in your own lives. So I've called it this. I've called it, you know, Talking God in the 21st Century. And the formal title is How New Forms of Media Are Changing the Way the Church Communicates. But I've got to be honest with you, a more accurate title would be How New Forms of Media Should Be Changing the Way the Church Communicates. Because the fact is, the church is still not communicating in a 21st century way. We're trying. And I really want to applaud the efforts of all of you who are using all forms of media and all this technology and these screens and these things to do it. We have a wonderful team here. Let's hear it for these high-tech guys that are all over the place. They're doing a great job. I think that George Bernard Shaw said it best. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Listen to me carefully. The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. Let's watch this video. Are we listening? Do you get the impression that we're listening? The big bear is out there. Are we listening? We don't have to give in. But I want to tell you, today's church is facing a big dilemma. And the big dilemma the church is facing is that church folks are making the assumption that everyone already knows what we're talking about. And that is our biggest communications gap. As a matter of fact, we are the best at this as Anglicans, as Episcopalians, we're the best. We get up on Sunday morning, and we've already greeted our newcomers. So we already know there's newcomers in the audience, and, oh, are there any newcomers? We'd like to welcome you. Well, this afternoon we want to invite you to the ECW. Make sure you're there. And the DOK is meeting next week. And by the way, the ABC just published a statement that the PB just sent to us. And nobody knows what we're talking about. We've got all this technical language. ECW, you've got to tell them as Episcopal Church women, because your newcomers have no idea. They don't know if it's a disease. They don't know what it is. And many times we talk as if we're all in a fishbowl and we're all very comfortable together, but we've got nothing to say to the outside world. So that's where the gap is first created. The gap is that we all think everybody knows what we're talking about. This happened to me with my little kids, with Albert and Camila. You're going to see them in a little while. Let's show them this. I was amazed. How many of you remember different strokes? Raise your hand. You'll remember this.
What you talking about? What you talking about? What you talking about? What you talking about, Willis?
How many remember what you're talking about, Willis? Well, I'll show you in this next slide. Two little kids. One day, my son Albert, who's 4 years old, he said something that I thought was outrageous. I don't remember what it was now. It's gone. I don't remember. Can you put him on there for me? That's Albert. He's 4 years old. That's Camila. She's 6, going on 21. And Albert said something, you know, and I said to him, "What you talk about, Willis?" He looked at me like I was speaking Chinese. He said, "Daddy, what did you just say?" And I said, "What you talking about, Willis?" Well, he and Camila just started cracking up. They thought it was a big joke. They were cracking up. I said, you never, and then I started scratching my head. I said, "Of course not. They never watched that stuff. You haven't watched it since you were 14 or 15. But thank God for YouTube." Well, first, thank God for Google, who led me to YouTube, and I said, my children have to know what you talking about, Willis, and what it's all about. So I found a bunch of those videos where you see him saying, "What you talking about, Willis?" So now they know. But before that, they did not know. I say this to you because sometimes church speaks in highly, I would say, specialized language, not just in our sermons, in our Christian education, not just in our sermons in Christian education, in our everyday communication with those around us. We tend to be pretty much within our comfort zone. And we forget that there's a whole world out there that has no clue what we're talking about. So one of the questions I like to ask is, how will we speak to the future generation of Christians? And how will they get it? You know, both Tracy and Chris touched upon this a lot, but Chris said something in his talk a little while ago that really stuck out in my mind. He said, you know, we complain about young people always being on their phones, you know, and some older ones too, like me. I love my phone. And you're on there and you're doing stuff. He says, but we complain and we think, oh, they're not connecting with anyone. It's quite the opposite. Through this, they're connecting with everyone. You can be in your bedroom and send a text to your kid that's 3 rooms away, because you know if you send a text, they're going to get it. If you say, "Hey, get over here," they're like, "Oh." Get what I'm saying? Communication has changed and is changing. It doesn't mean that that's the way we should communicate, you know, all the time within the family. One of the things we like to do during family time and meals is everybody turns off their technology and we just talk to each other the old-fashioned way. But that's more of an exercise and a discipline that we need to create. But when it comes to communicating in the world today, how do we do it? So I want to share with you some thoughts. What are the reasons for our communications gap, especially in the church, as ministers of the gospel, as people committed to bringing the message of Jesus Christ to this world, to the 21st century world? The first thing is, we're still dealing, believe it or not, we're still dealing with a certain kind of suspicion of new media within the church world. How many of you would agree with the statement? Yay or nay? Okay. Those of you that don't agree with it, listen to me for a moment. A real life example. One real life example. There are leaders in our church, lay and clergy, who believe that if you're on Facebook, if you're on Twitter, it's kind of superficial. That it's kind of, oh, you don't want to post everything. I've never posted when I go to the bathroom on Facebook and Twitter. Have you? No. When you post a message about today's gospel reading, or when you post something about, inviting people to prayer for something that's happening in the world, or when you post something about an injustice occurring right now in an immediate way, you watch the news and you hear of a certain type of vote that our government has been involved in that impacts millions of people, and it's a negative thing, and you ask others to join in some form of advocacy or some form of action, that's not superficial. But you'd be surprised that there are still in this day and age church leaders who think, that's kind of superficial, I don't get into that. Well, I've got to tell you, wake up and smell the coffee. This is the 21st century. And there's a reason why so many millions of people are on social media. You know why they're there? Access to information, access to communication, bridge building, connecting with people. If we're not there, we're allowing everything else to be heard, to be said, to be interpreted, but we're not putting in our 2 cents worth. It reminds me of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Mother Teresa once went to England to visit her nuns. And when she got off the plane, a bunch of reporters were there, obviously, to see the holy woman arrive to their country. And as she got off the plane, one of the reporters said, hey, Mother, is it true? Is it true that you and your sisters are pretending to end world hunger? And Mother Teresa was about this big. I mean, she was this big. And looked up at the man and smiled. He said, young man, I want you to know something, she said. I want you to know that if my sisters and I work for the poor, it's because we understand that God is only asking us to do about this much. It's like a drop of water in the ocean. And she said, but we also know that if that drop was not in the ocean would be missing something. Believe it or not, my friends, social media is missing something. Every time active, committed disciples of Jesus don't use the opportunity to spread a message of faith and to somehow use it as a very, very effective means of communication and evangelism in today's world. So I would say that's the first gap. We've got to get rid of our fear and our suspicions. The second is, the listening context in the 21st century is changing and evolving at a rate that most of our mainstream denominations are not willing to embrace. Do you understand what I mean when I say listening context? The way people listen and receive information has totally changed. Tracy said it when she talked about visual things. Chris reaffirmed it, and I'm here to tell you again. So now you've had 3 speakers today telling you the same thing. The listening context is changing. You may not have a personal appreciation for everything that happens in these technologies, but you've got to put that aside. We all have to put it aside, because the truth is our listening context has changed. Our brains have changed, and we're going to talk about that in just a moment. The third thing that I believe causes the gap is that most of our language, like I said before, and I'm going to reiterate it again, most of our language continues to be theological/theoretical. It is not accessible, practical. The way we speak still makes us sound like religious professional people. Does that sound familiar? You remember Jesus' big complaint about the Pharisees? They widened their phylacteries, and they were very, very, very ready to ask everyone to do great things, but they were unwilling to do it. Do you remember that? Sometimes the professional church acts that way. Sometimes as church leaders, we think that we are being accessible by using all of our professional lingo. And we think that we are really communicating a message effectively, but I'm here to tell you, we've got to really make it more practical. And I'm not saying dumb it down. Listen carefully. I'm saying connect. Don't dumb it down. Connect. Seek to connect. Storytelling connects. Everyone wants to hear a story. Right or wrong? Everyone wants to hear a story. Why do you think Jesus used the parables? Jesus used the parables because stories are amazing. Stories connect us with earthly realities. We believe in an incarnational gospel, right? The Word became, how'd you know that? The Word became flesh. That's right. The Word became flesh. You say that in an audience of people that have not heard the gospel recently, and they cannot complete the statement. Listen to me carefully. They cannot complete the statement. Let's do it now. How many of you like Sinatra? Sinatra. Okay, good. I say that's life. That's life. That's what all the people say. You're flying high in April. How did you know that? You've heard it before, right? Los latinos, ¿cuántos dominicanos hay aquí? A ver. Okay. Pa, 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 patacón pisao, pisao, patacón pisao, patacón pisao, patacón pisao. How'd you know that? You heard it before. You get my point? We are familiar with the gospel. We are familiar with the message. We can say the Word became and dwelt among us. But people who have no connection with our message can't complete the statement. Listen to me. I was a trustee at the American Bible Society. In the year 2000, we did a study. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the American Bible Society. It's one of the oldest institutions in the U.S. President John Quincy Adams was one of the trustees. I mean, it's part of our nation's history. And it was an honor to be there. I was the first Cuban American elected ever on that board. And I can tell you this. When we did the study, they went on the streets of New York and they put a camera with a microphone in front of people's faces and asked biblical questions. You would be surprised. In our beautiful Judeo-Christian nation, when people asked about the apostles, they put them somewhere in the Old Testament. When they asked about the prophets, they put them somewhere after Jesus. When people ask basic questions about how many gospels there were, no clue. I mean, if you heard the answers, you would laugh. This is in Central Park. You know, educational level, pretty elevated. But when it came to religion and faith and basic Bible stuff, horrible. We need to realize that is the listening context we're living in. When we speak about faith, we must speak in a way that is practical and accessible. We must speak in a way that reaches those who are listening to us. And that's becoming harder and harder, by the way. The people who used to come to your Episcopal parish 50 years ago are not the people coming now. A lack of acceptance. This is a very important one. The lack of acceptance of the cultural realities that surround us. Part of our gap is that we've lost contact with our neighborhood. We've lost contact with who would come if they could come. I'm going to give you an example. 22 years ago, I was ordained a priest. And I was sent to St. Clement's Parish in Wilton Manors, Florida. Now, Wilton Manors is a little municipality within Fort Lauderdale. When I went there 22 years ago, the parish was totally blue-collar. The majority of the folks were from Pittsburgh. Listen to me carefully. Seriously, they had left Pittsburgh and had bought their homes there in Wilton Manors. Their only experience and memory of priests were Irish priests. So imagine, this Cuban-American kid, I was 25 years old and 30 pounds lighter. And I'm standing at the front door of the church, greeting people after the first Sunday Eucharist. And the lady comes up to me, and she says, Father, what part of Ireland are you from? And I said, well, I'm from another island. The pastor was a very holy man. Father MacDonald had come from Ireland 30, 40 years before. He had an amputated leg because of diabetes, and they send this young priest as his associate, and when I get there, he says to me, young man, I don't know why, well, he didn't say it that way. He said, oh, lad, I don't know why the bishop sent you here. He says, oh, this is a dying parish. Oh, sure. Oh, Jesus, this is a dying parish. And I said, well, Father. So you can imagine, when you're 25 years old and just ordained, I mean, you're like, you have this messianic complex, right? You're gonna, right? You're gonna save the world. You don't want to hear that you just got sent to a dying parish. So I went out to the supermarket, less than a block away from church. And as I'm walking in the supermarket, I'm down the first aisle, and all I hear is, oye, chico, blah, 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 Spanish. I'm like, Go down the second aisle. Oye, chico, blah, blah, blah. More Spanish. Third aisle, you know, just people chit-chatting in Spanish, which happened to be my first language. So I get back to the rectory that night, and we're having dinner. And I turn over to the good Monsignor and I say, Father, I gotta tell you, this neighborhood is packed with Latinos. Oh, sure, lad. Oh, they're not from here, sure. Oh, no, they live over in that other parish. Oh, no, they're not really here. I said, no, Father, right here, right next. I said, Father, what's the last time you went to the supermarket? Now, remember, in Roman Catholic rectories, you've got a cook, a housekeeper, and all that. So the poor priest, he never had to go to the supermarket. He didn't go there in 25 years. He said to me, oh, sure, I haven't been there in 25 years. I said, oh, Monsignor, please come with me. I'll wheel you around. We'll go see the supermarket. I want you to come. He said, oh, okay. He says, we'll have a meeting with the Hispanics and see what they need. But we won't have a Spanish service. We will not have a Spanish service. Well, that day, a few of the Latinos from the parish helped me, and we put flyers everywhere. And we had a little library media center in the church that sat about 100, 120. And all of a sudden, when we look out, there were like 200 people in this media center. It was packed. And all of a sudden, yeah, I know, we were excited too. But then all of a sudden, the Monsignor shows up in the wheelchair and he sits next to me. And of course, 60% of the people could not communicate in English, but they were very respectful of the priest. He was a pastor, and the associate priest there. I'm wet behind the ears, right out of seminary, standing there, and he begins to give a talk in English, which, by the way, 70% or more of the people didn't understand. But he spoke and he said he wanted to learn Spanish, and he did this and he did that, and most of the people couldn't get the brogue, but it was heavy brogue. But okay, Father spoke, and they were very, they applauded in that. But there won't be a Spanish service. So Father can help you with spiritual direction, and if you need help, and if you need, a quinceañera or a wedding, but there won't be a Spanish service. Now, of course, I've always been a little bit on the rebellious side. And I spoke to the people in Spanish, and then at the end of my talk, I said, well, ustedes saben que Dios es el que manda. God is in control. Y si Dios quiere, if God wants, maybe we'll have a Spanish service. Si Dios quiere, tendremos un servicio en español. Well, the whole place just came down with applause. And the Monsignor decided he needed to clap too, because they were all clapping, so he started clapping. It worked out perfectly, because 2 months later, I got a new pastor, and we started the Spanish service. And Our cultural realities that surround us are speaking to the church. Some people see it as a threat. Oh my God, are you kidding? A Latino congregation in this church, we've heard they don't give money. You're right. It takes them a while to learn stewardship. Just like it's taking a lot of Anglos time to learn stewardship, because let me tell you, I have a parish with no Spanish service, and let me tell you, it's hard to get it every year. And you have to beg for those pledge cards, right? I say this to you because it's a process of education, but it's a process of openness. The cultural realities that surround us are not just communication realities, they're gaps. The church has a gap, and that gap can only be filled with the grace of God and trust and then an ability to take risks and to go beyond what we're accustomed to. Living outside of our fishbowl, living outside of our box, taking that leap is so important. And we can all do it. Part of my work for the, put the brain back up there, will you? We need the brain. Okay, or the brains. There's 4 of them. Part of my work in my dissertation for my Doctor of Ministry degree required that I go into a little bit of neuroscience, believe it or not, a little bit of this whole idea of brain imaging. Have you heard of brain imaging? They can look at our brains now and know what's going on, believe it or not. So be careful what you're thinking. The truth is, this was a study done for people who were deaf, mute, blind, and what scientists discovered, and I believe it was at Princeton, if I'm not mistaken, not too far from here, what they discovered was that the way the brain functions applies to all of us, regardless of our abilities to be able to hear, listen, understand, because we all perceive information somehow, and so different parts of the brain are used for different things. So for example, if you look at the first one up there, A, this is what happens when we're speaking. So right now, that little part of my brain is going, and yours doesn't have to worry about that unless you're gossiping with your neighbor right now, and then it's doing it. But if you're talking, if I'm the one here that has that part being stimulated right now because I'm speaking to you, and then B is the part that you would be being stimulated right now. You are being stimulated by listening to speech. But guess what? You're also being stimulated by listening to the environment. The noises that are around us, whatever they may be. The secondary noises, believe it or not, your brain is picking those up too. Isn't that amazing? The fourth is what happens to those who read Braille. Look at all of the parts of the brain that are stimulated by those who read Braille. Now imagine if I were to show you a brain that is talking to my wife while I'm texting my senior warden, while I'm listening to my kids scream in the backyard, ah! While the dog is barking. And we've got some music in the background, of course. You get what I'm saying? We are realizing more and more that this multitasking of our lives is changing our brains, and it's changing the way we perceive information. It's changing the way we go to church. That's why in the past we would say to people, or maybe some of you have it already, you have these big signs that say, silence your cell phones. I'm seeing less and less of those signs. The reason is because we got to get people, it's what the bishop said at the beginning, we got to get people to turn off their ringers so they don't interrupt with the worship. But we've got to get people to get on Twitter and say, I just heard this in the sermon, God is with you, God loves you no matter what. I just posted this picture on Facebook. I just did this. Let me tell you something. I cannot tell you, and those of you that follow me on Twitter, by the way, right now if you don't follow me on Twitter, it's just considered a venial sin. After you're aware of it, it becomes a mortal sin. See? Just joking. I don't believe that theology. What I'm saying is, follow me on Twitter, Padre Alberto, right? If you follow me on Twitter, you see that I tweet all the time, at least one message a day, at least one message a day. Sometimes I send something from Forward Movement, sometimes I send the gospel of the day, sometimes it's just a picture about something happening in life, something inspirational, an invitation to do this or to do that. What I'm saying to you is, if the 36,000 people who claim to be followers, or who are followers, of I Am Episcopal, which is or I Am Episcopalian, which is our official church Twitter account. If those 36,000 people all decided to retweet something that the PB wrote, or to retweet something from Forward Movement, or to retweet something of what you've heard here today, it'd be amazing the impact we would create in social media. You'd be surprised. I can't tell you how many times, and my wife is a witness of this, I've gotten testimonies from people that were saying, Father, I was sure that was going to be my last day here. I was sure. The message that you sent gave me so much comfort, gave me comfort to my soul. And then I'll get a private message or an email saying, thank you for sending that message. And you know, it's not my message. It's not your message. It's God's message. It's God's message being resent. It's God's message reaching that person that God needs to hear it. And so we are instruments and disciples of Christ in this world. That's what we need to be passionate about. How can we send the message that God once sent with these forms of media that we have now? Let me show you this. This is a bit of a complicated survey. Just what you needed, right? Just what you needed, another survey. But I wrote this one. Those of you that have my book, Talking God, or got it or will get it, I'm going to tell you this. It's really not about preaching. The title is kind of misleading. It's about communication in the 21st century. It's not just geared toward preachers. It's geared toward all leaders in the church that need to communicate the message of the gospel. If you look at this, these numbers are very telling. Look at what it says up here. It says, in your perception as preacher, now this is directed toward those who teach, whether you teach Sunday school, Christian education, Bible study, whatever. I'm talking about communicating the message of the gospel. In your perception, how has the internet, social media, mobile phones, tablets impact your listeners and the listening context? 65% said it had some impact. Only 12 said that it had significant impact. But if I ask them about their delivery, if you're in your delivery and preparation as a preacher, what impact do the new forms of media have? Then they say 73. Some impact or no impact. Over here 4. So it shows you we're still not using new forms of media to prepare our lessons. We're still counting on the old book and the old thing and the old notes, whatever it is. Handouts, you're wasting paper. Shame on you, you're getting rid of trees. Number 3, in my personal experience as preacher, I would say the overall impact of new forms of media have on my preaching experience is, and you get here 68, and then significant 9. Look how low it is among the preachers, the professional church people, the church education, religious education teachers. Now let's go to the people in the pews. By the way, these were actual people. I used 100 clergy, and those were mostly clergy of all denominations. I had, up there you've got mostly Episcopal priests, but you've also got deacons, you've also got Presbyterian pastors, Baptist pastors, Roman Catholic clergy, mostly professional clergy that preach every Sunday, did the top part. But look at the bottom part. Look at the change in numbers. Same questions. Same questions. Now you're talking to the people in the pews. 65 turns to 70, 73 turns to 90, 68 turns to 80, and look at the top. What it tells me, if you look at the numbers carefully, is that we are still not connected to the importance of new forms of media. And it's not just the professional church people, it's also the people in the pews. Still no significant impact registers among people. But I'm going to tell you what's going to happen to us. It's the same thing that always happens. The church takes its time. But time doesn't stop. Tick, 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 tick. The longer we take, the more people we're going to lose. Because a significant number of our congregations bury a bunch of people every year. But it doesn't mean you're bringing in that many new ones. I hope you are. I hope you are. But every time I see a parishioner of mine go home to the Lord, or a family move away, which in Florida is very common for people to always move away, right? Transient communities. I wonder, who will replace them next year? You ever wonder that? If we don't use social media now, we are wasting the opportunity to reach out to others, to bring in new believers. To bring in new believers and to nurture new leaders. That's one of the things we say we're going to do as Anglicans, nurture new leaders. So what can we do to assume that God's message is heard today? Yeah, you see what's happening? What's happening? Hey, God, wait a minute, man. I got something else going on. Can you wait a minute? I'm on my laptop. I'm on my iPhone, right? How will God's message reach the people of today? Well, I'll tell you there are 3 biblical motivations. For those of you that need it right out of Scripture, I'm going to give it to you. Right out of Scripture. The first one is, go out. The gospel is best preached when it motivates others to go out, and when we are constantly looking at ourselves as a community nourished and strengthened by the sacraments, by the preaching of the word, and then we go out and make it flesh in the world. Don't be afraid. Why are we afraid? I'll tell you why I think we're afraid. We're afraid because it makes us vulnerable. I know of one bishop that said to me he does not use Twitter or Facebook because he's concerned about how the message will be perceived, or he is concerned about what people will do with that message. That kind of fear paralyzes. That's the perfect formula for an absent church. We don't want the church to be absent in society, then we who are church leaders cannot be absent from where most of society is. And guess what? I hate to say this, but they're not sitting in your pews. They're out there waiting to have a reason to sit in your pews. They're out there wondering, why should I be part of that faith family? Why should I do it? Are you going to send them postcards? Are you going to put an ad in the paper? You can do all that. But I bet you if you posted stuff consistently on social media, if you use Facebook in a creative way to reach the people around you, you would be getting to a lot more people than with any of those classical formulas of advertising. We have to get rid of the fear. The next thing up there is, all things are possible to those who believe. Nothing is impossible with God. We hear that constantly in the gospel. It's there. We basically have to allow the Lord Jesus to get rid of that fear that's inside of the institutional church. It's so much part of our box. We have to get rid of the fear. We can either have a church which is connected or a church which is disconnected. A connected church is a church that is accessible, not just because it's on a certain corner where people walk by and they hear your music and say, wow, look at that church, I'm going to walk in. You have other ways to connect your church today. The other thing we got to ask ourselves is, do we want a church that is present or a church that is absent? Because I've got to tell you something. Nowadays, if you are not somehow in the media, you are not. Let's just be honest. If you are not connected to some form of media, you really basically don't exist. So how are people going to get to that place unless you're somehow there? And I'm not saying you have to invest anything. I'm telling you, most of this stuff is free. Having a Twitter account is free. Having a Facebook account is free. Getting one of your teenage acolytes to record part of your sermon or your service and putting it on Facebook is free. You don't need to have a production budget for next year. You just need to get a few people interested in spreading the good news. It basically comes down to this. The real challenge for the 21st century church is, are we willing to take a leap and enter into this new territory God is calling us to? Let me ask you a question. How did we get here? How did we get here to 2017 if it wasn't because of courageous missionaries who left everything behind and went to those faraway places and took the gospel. How did we get here unless there were a bunch of women and men who were courageous enough to say, we're going to take a leap and go into that unknown territory? How did we get here? The missionary spirit is part of the church. It's part of who we are. We cannot be absent in those new territories. The new mission territory in our world today is social media. To be present in Twitter, to be present in Facebook, to be present in Instagram, whatever you can do to get your church's message out there. That's the challenge of the 21st century. To jump out of our fishbowl, jump out of our comfort zone and say, we're willing to take the chance. I don't know any better formula, by the way. If you're looking for a formula for church growth, I don't know any better formula. When my wife and I became Episcopalians, I told the bishop, give me the toughest parish you've got. I should have kept my mouth shut. I got a parish with 28 people. When I left there were 300 worshiping every weekend. I didn't have an advertising budget. I didn't have, you know what we had? A bunch of people that were excited about what was happening in our parish, and they were tweeting, and they were Facebooking, and they were doing. I am now at a parish with 500 ASA, which, by the way, those folks are a lot less prone to promote stuff on Facebook and Twitter, and I'm always on them about it, because we got a lot of young people, a lot of great leaders, but they're so comfortable because they've got this big church that they have no need. You know what? The people at Resurrection, for them it was urgent. And they used that urgency and they turned it into a larger congregation. And then we welcomed the Hispanic congregation, and that grew the church. The English-speaking congregation grew as the Spanish congregation grew, because that will automatically happen. A lot of you think, oh, we start a Spanish service, that means the Spanish service is going to grow and the English service won't. I got something to tell you. People like me, we go English or Spanish the same way. So if you start a Spanish service, you'd be surprised. You're going to get a lot of kids and grandkids that want to stay in the English service, and they're going to tell their parents, bring me to the English service. I have a bunch of Latinos in the English service at Resurrection now, and they prefer to go to the English service. And then there's the people who go to the Spanish. So the church will grow when you show a generous welcoming. When you show that we're here for everyone, the church will grow, believe me. Let me see what other silly thing I have up there. Oh, I have that. No, I don't want to see that. Okay, that's my book. It's back there at the end. The reason I wrote this book, or the reason I got this idea for this thesis, was that I was convinced that we can use the gifts God has given us in the 21st century to talk God. We can use it. It's true, most of us are concerned about the growth of the nuns, and they're not the ladies in the nice habits that live in the convent, but the N-O-N-E-S nuns, right? The ones who say, we don't believe in anything. Well, the only way we're going to be able to bridge that gap is by speaking in 21st century language. If I say to you something that you do not understand, what good is that for you? But if I say it in a way that you can grasp it and take it to heart, it can transform your life. So today I want you all to leave here knowing that my motivation is my love for Jesus and for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I know that all of us in the room, all of us, have that same motivation. That all of us as baptized Christians understand that the life-giving, saving message of Jesus must be heard, and that we're here to do that. We're here to carry it out. The Lord has put us here with that purpose. So we all share that same purpose. Let's use the instruments and the gifts that God has given us to carry this out. Amen. Amen.